I want to express our appreciation here at the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community for the continual support of Seminole State College of Florida. This is a relationship that really spans several decades. When Dr. Stephen Caldwell Wright was on faculty at then Seminole Community College, the relationship was very strong. Now that Professor Trent Domingo has come to us as a member of the Zora Festival National Planners, we're very pleased to see that the relationship has resumed. This series is very important to us as a part of the Humanities Expression for Festival. And I simply want to again express the appreciation of our organization that the Seminole State College of Florida sees fit to include the Seminole Speaker Series as a part of the Zora Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more note before I give you our speaker for the night. We want to take this time to thank the Speaker Series co-sponsor, Edition Financial. They are the preferred credit union for Seminole State, and they have a new full-service branch in our Sanford Lake Mary campus. So we want to thank them for their continued support of the college. So it is my pleasure to introduce to the Seminole State family, Dr. Rebecca Wanzo. When I learned of the title of her newest book, I was really, really excited because of what I teach. And the things that I teach, I know the importance of how popular imagery shape our thinking. And so I know tonight's presentation is going to be really informative. So Dr. Wanzo is professor and chair of the Department of Women and Gender Studies and Sexuality Studies. She is an author of award-winning books. One of the books is The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African-American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling. Also the content of our Caricature, African-American Comic Art and Political Belonging, which is the book that I was referring to earlier. She's published in many, many, many journals that I won't take the time to list here, but she's also written for CNN, LA Review Books, Huffington Post, The Conversation, and the comic book Bitch Planet. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Rebecca Wanzo. Dr. Wanzo, it's all yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Zora Festival and Seminole State University for the invite. I truly wish I could be there with you in person, but the Rona just doesn't want to let us get on with our lives. So maybe I can make it there one day. So this talk does draw from my book, and I will just say in advance that I was very careful to remove the most offensive images from my book, so you will not get the racist porn that some people get in the talk. But if you want to see it, you are free to buy the book, or maybe your library can get it. So, but in all seriousness, I really hope that I have a chance to introduce you to some comics and cartoonists that you're not familiar with this evening, and also to have a really serious conversation about the way we have this binary about positive and negative representations that maybe sometimes is a little more complicated than we think. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to show you PowerPoint. All right, and I'm gonna minimize this so you still see me up here. All right, so I'm gonna start with this 2007 Independence Day cartoon from African-American cartoonist Kyle Baker. It depicts a man you will probably recognize as Thomas Jefferson, right? You see the garb, you see the hair, you see we hold these truths to be self-evident, but then you also see here in the corner, this small little figure. peering through the panes behind him, this black ink blot with white dots for eyes and white lips and hair. That students who've taken these classes will be familiar with, probably the Pickaninny caricature. And so this is a grotesque representation that has no real relationship to how Black people look. And so readers also who have knowledge that, you know, when this child says, "Daddy, I'm cold," that Jefferson, of course, had multiple children with enslaved woman Sally Hemings, was the half sister of his deceased wife. And this Black figure is nonetheless referencing his very light-skinned children. So with this "Daddy, I'm cold," with a silhouetted backdrop of what appears to be an overseer and a horse casting his whip towards a slave woman with her arms in the air, and the gender seems to be signified by the head wrap on the head. Black people are left out in the cold, literally and figuratively, right? Black people are left out of the cold of the Constitution as 3/5 person. They are left out in the cold of citizenship. So when I posted this cartoon on Facebook, I had a brilliant African-American scholar ask me, why was I circulating such an ugly image? It's like, girl, what you doing? And so then I explained who the creator was and I explained my interpretation. But we should think about it, if an image may need explanation, even for really discerning readers, it demonstrates how perilous it can be to use such representations. But it's the grotesque image, and I'm going to back to this for a minute, that makes it work, right? The dark humor of the cartoon, and the puns intended there, it depends on this Black child in the window. So usually you have these Independence Day cartoons, it's like, yay, Jefferson, yay, the founding. But here it's like, oh, wait, there's some of us who are left out. That's what sort of, you know, catches our eye. It disrupts the framing in all senses of the word. It foregrounds Black injury in the nation's founding. And he is a man of African-American descent, but he uses this to demonstrate how such negative and grotesque images could be generative still in thinking about how we talk about how African-Americans are treated as citizens. So what I want us to think about or talk about today is how negative representations of Black people may not always mean what you think they mean. So yes, more often than not, almost always, they're meant to hurt the people they reference, right? Progressive uses of negative representations like Baker's also risk audiences consuming them uncritically or being condemned even by readers that are really sophisticated, right? And comedy and comic art are similar in that they have stereotypes, this repetition of a kind of generalized type and typology embedded in their foundations for humor, or how they do their work, how they do satire, how they make critique. So, but what happens when someone uses stereotype or caricature to call attention to racism? Sometimes the focus on positive and negative binaries can contribute to this kind of aesthetic flattening of all the work that Black artists do in all these other contexts, right? So, and it's not always just Black artists, and so I'll go back to the image. It's probably familiar to some of you. Some of you may remember this Barry Blitz cover of the New Yorker. And this is when Barack Obama was running for office. And he's standing there with this picture of Osama bin Laden hanging on the wall, and there's a flag burning in the fireplace. Obama's wearing a turban, and he's looking kind of shifty towards the viewer. He bumps fists with Michelle, and maybe you remember where people are like, oh, they bump fists, you know, it's like a terrorist fist bump. And, you know, it's a common gesture of intimacy among Black people. But if you watch, you know, various other things like Fox News, there was, I think it was Fox News that said, is it a terrorist fist bump? And it nonetheless just really inspired all this conspiracy-minded talk. And so Blitz is really playing with these Republican claims that Michelle is this dangerous Black radical, her relaxed hair isn't an afro. The radicalism of her natural hair is accessorized by a machine gun. And we can say all kinds of things about what it means that natural hair is radical, but we can come back to that. The camouflage pants and the combat boots. So some people immediately took issue with the image. And Michelle Obama's talked about this. I mean, it was hurtful for her to see this cover. And some people said that the New Yorker, probably thought, well, the New Yorker readership they're sophisticated. They can get the joke. So like this one columnist said, this is going to upset a lot of people, probably for the same reason it's going to delight a lot of other people, namely those on the right, because it's got all the scare tactics and misinformation that's so far been used to derail Barack Obama's campaign, all in one handy illustration. Anyone who tried to paint him as a Muslim, anyone who tried to portray Michelle as angry or a secret revolutionary or out to get Whitey, anyone who's questioned their patriotism, well, here's your image. So I think it's really important that this columnist called this an illustration. Now, some other people call it a cartoon. And this distinction isn't insignificant. Medium and genre are really important in terms of thinking of how the meaning is made transparent. So the title or the caption of the cartoon was actually called Fist Bump, The Politics of Fear. It's inside the cover. And he is a cartoonist. Often you see his images, you see him on the cover, but you also see them inside. And if you had that text, it would show a tension between the image and the text, right? And so it has an example of what editorial cartoons, they have what I call a triangulated interpretive structure, right? You see an image, you see a text, and the text can often refer to what you're supposed to be looking at. So you're not supposed to be looking just the image standing in itself. The text often produces a tension, it's irony, and it helps you read the image. So then that calls attention to who is reading the Obamas in this way, right? So it makes the people who are constructing the Obamas this way the true object of the satire. And so editorial cartoons often use this structure. The language provides the irony, right? Now, of course, not all cartoons have words. Transparency isn't an expectation of art. And the job of an illustration is to help the viewer visualize an idea or narrative. Some people thought New Yorker, like just even the New Yorker title would be enough to tell people that this was not critiquing the Obamas. But people still might have condemned the image, even if the caption had been there, because they just didn't want to see this representation of them. Like you produced that representation and people thought this was violence in itself. So a lot of people are saying, well, he had all this racist intent, and he didn't. He very clearly did not. He was very clearly commenting. He said he was. His history of art would tell you that he's critiquing how people are constructing them. The title of the cartoon tells you what his intent was, but there'd be people who still wouldn't want the image. So it helps us think about the difference that genre might make, like in an interpretation, like if it's an illustration or if it's a cartoon, right? And illustrations and editorial cartoons can do really different things, right? And so this isn't to say that editorial cartoons aren't often racist, like there's a long history of racist editorial cartoons. But here it's like how someone's using a negative representation, but they're not using it to make the people who present it negatively interpret it in a way that you're trying to critique them. It's trying to critique people who are trying to construct them in this way. So he's, Blitz, the creator of this work, is very liberal, right? And he had the best intentions, but it's still, I think it hurt Michelle Obama. She said it took her back, that she's like, do people really see her this way? And it's hard to avoid producing this pain because there's such this long history of what I call visual imperialism, right? It's constructing Black people as lesser human beings. It dehumanizes Black people, and they're constructed as lesser citizens. And the problem is that Blitz and many other creators working in this medium have to negotiate, is that they work in a medium that depends on caricature, right? So how do you avoid replicating racist representations or the accusation that you are? And so the reality is maybe they won't. So racist caricature was created to dehumanize. So what I want to talk about today is how there are artists, I'm going to focus on Black artists as opposed to Blitz, who often use these ugly representations to talk about how grotesque it is, to talk about how violent white supremacy is. And so I'm going to take you through the work of some African-American cartoonists. Probably you won't know any of them, but to show how they sometimes make use of caricature to call attention to white supremacy and white nationalism, and to show how Black people have been excluded from citizenship. Okay, so I'm starting here. This is a cartoon by George Harriman. And he's often hailed as creating one of the greatest comics of all time, Crazy Cat. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Artists like Salvador Dali loved it because of its surrealism, how gorgeous it was. A lot of people talk about inspiring Tom and Jerry. And he produced other works, though, including the short-lived strip called Musical Mouse, only 3 strips, for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. And Mose is this musician with this black 8-ball for a head and this white tubular mouth. And he tries to find work all the time by impersonating other ethnic groups. So in this one strip, he's attempting to be Irish, Scottish, and he's found out, and he disappears in this cloud of hands and feet as members of the group he tries to impersonate, that's what it's impersonation, just beat him up. So Harriman's biographer, Michael Tisserand, describes it as like the most brutal scene the cartoonist ever created. And Moses is kind of inhuman representation of black people, just like that, ink block caricature was, right? But it was a really common representation in the early 20th century. You couldn't, walk around a corner, open up anything almost without seeing a negative representation like this. So, what do you do with this strip? I mean, it's so nasty. And, and part of how it works is that no one failed to recognize that he is Black, right? At least Black in terms of this really grotesque caricature of Blackness. So the joke is on those initially deceived, as well as on his delusional belief that he could pass as anything but what he is. But his wounded, objection and sadness at the end depicts his inevitable comeuppance. His girlfriend tries to remind him that there are more appropriate spaces for him to inhabit. So obviously this caricature, if you look at it, you see the Black face that you see in minstrelsy, you see in vaudeville, you see in lots of representations of early 20th century Black culture. However, here's the thing. Harriman was categorized as colored on his birth certificate and passed for white for most of his life. I mean, he wore this hat on his head to cover up the hair texture, indoors, all the time. Nobody asked why, I guess. They said he was Greek. That's how the story goes. And so there's some critics who said, well, I don't think there's anything about racism in here. This one critic named M. Thomas Ing, who passed away recently, said, it'd be strange humor for an African-American passing as white to be doing a strip like this and use this kind of representation. He clearly wasn't thinking very deeply about it, and he just used the traditional racial humor of the day. But let's think about this. Harriman was probably aware that the discovery of his designation on his birth certificate would almost certainly destroy his career in the papers he was working in, and also any other paper in the white world. This is a period, right, where Black people primarily worked for the Black press, but most of the money was with, predominantly white press, and this was a different moment of newspapers. Newspapers were where it was at. And the autobiographical criticism could help us see how this strip is this violent illustration of the risk and potential cost of passing, right? And passing if you're discovered. And even when their skills and abilities should create the conditions for acceptance. So this idea of Mose as this double for Harriman is perhaps too reductive, given how common minstrelsy and other kinds of racist representations were in early 20th century. But how can we not really imagine that the Black artist accepted and entertaining until he's discovered, and then who's beaten and brutalized for the sin of trying to pass, couldn't be a little evocative of the risk in Harriman's life, right? He was wearing that hat, right? He was trying to cover stuff up. He passed until after his death. So we might read this differently. We think, okay, he's a little bit, he's not quite a clear double for Harriman, but there's something there, right? And so the thing about it is that, people who just never thought of him as of African descent for a long time, this isn't the only place where you see this, right? And so once you know this, you can read his work a little differently. So one thing to know is in the early 20th century, boxing was just where it was at. And so there were actually just boxing cartoons. Lots of people produced one panel comics or comic strips about boxing. People were writing about boxing. And one of the biggest issues with boxing was, when Black people were coming up to fight white people. And there were some strips, like when, you know, a Black person won, there's like one editorial cartoon where like the white world was crying in the corner and the Black world was like laughing, you know, again, as the sort of racist stereotype, and dancing around the ring, because it's like, oh, it's like the destruction of the white race because this Black boxer won. So it was really this measure for a lot of people of trying to prove the superiority of different racial groups, right? So Harriman also produced boxing cartoons. And this one is addressing Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. And so Jack Johnson, you might know, was a really famous, flamboyant boxer. And he is someone that white folks were very concerned about. He ran around with a lot of white women. He was just very flamboyant, walking around with fur coats and stuff like this. He just refused a certain kind of respectability politics. So see, here he's depicted with the kind of racist caricature that you might expect, but you see that you have this sort of white guy trying to push him, the other boxer trying to push him, Jim Jeffries, out of the elephant, right? And the promoters are arguing at the feet of the elephant. Jeffries' manager, they're all white. They're depicted cartoonishly, but not with the kind of racist caricature that we see with Johnson. And, you know, if they, what's being said here is that, well, you shove us out if you imbalance this, like this could be bad for the elephant. And Jeffries' like, oh, just go away. I'm not comfortable with you here. And it's just this anxiety that's being expressed here about the Black person's presence, right? And it's just a little different than what you see usually in the white press with these boxing cartoons. Here's another one. And this was actually a series of comics. I'm just showing you Laughing Sam Lanford, who is depicted as a cat. This is also important in thinking about Crazy Cat later on. He often depicted Black people's cats, and then he did the strip where there's no clear racial designation with Crazy Cat, and it would be a mistake just to read every Crazy Cat strip about race. But it's interesting how often he did depict Black people's cats. And eventually, so this boxer thinks that, oh, see, I've tamed him, I've caged him, and then he breaks out, right? And so usually these boxing strips had white people really triumphing over the Black boxer, you know, or just like mourning if they lose or something. But these strips have the white people on the run, or they're anxious. They clearly seem just so distressed about these Black folks triumphing over them, and just even imagining the Black people can triumph over them in these strips, as you see with the elephant and you see with the strip. Harriman's just doing a little something different than you see with a lot of the white strips about boxing at the time. So again, when we know his background, you're like, okay, so even though he's not depicting Black people realistically, even though he is depicting them as animals or racialized caricature with features, maybe there's still a way that he's thinking about racial stereotype and caricature. And so I think we should just think about how W.B. Du Bois, you know, famously talked about what Black art should do. And he said, you know, it really needs to be propaganda, or I don't care, right? And so a lot of what he championed was really beautiful art from Black people to show the accomplishments of Black civilization. And people don't really think about Black artists as contributing, Black artists who are cartoonists, as contributing to this Black visual culture tradition. But I think it is interesting to think about these people in the Black press or in these other various contexts as cartoonists also doing this work. And Harriman, in this very different way, was doing some propaganda here too. But I'm gonna shift to somebody else here. This is an editorial cartoon from Sam Millay, who was an editorial cartoonist for a Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the most important Black newspapers, along with the Chicago Defender, in the first half of the 20th century. And Millay was actually very concerned about Black radicalism. So as opposed to some of his counterparts, say there's a cartoonist named Chester Commodore at the Chicago Defender, who really embraced Black power and embraced Black radicalism, Millet was very concerned about it. So he would actually use caricature to try to speak to how Black people were harming the cause for Black citizenship. So here you have these, if you can read, this says a violent Negro element on the hands and Black power. And then you have bigots eating the table. So he's basically saying, like, see, you're just giving them what they want. You're feeding the bigots and the segregationists with your activism. So for him, he wasn't really embracing King's idea that, riots were the language of the unheard, right? Or uprisings, Black uprisings in the cities were language of the unheard. They're just simply reduced to violent Negroes here. Here's another example. This is depicting, it's from 1966. Senator Everett Dickerson has this filibuster. He's trying to bury this 1966 Civil Rights Bill, which is a different civil rights bill than you're probably familiar with. And he crafted this compromise about the power to regulate discriminatory action in private businesses. And he wasn't an easy ally, and he rejected the bill in relationship to housing, because there was this whole language at the time about this fictional white landlady like Mrs. Murphy, like, oh, if you make it so that you can't discriminate in housing, these landladies who are like, or have boarding houses, these white women, they'll have to rent to Black men. And then we can't force, Mrs. Murphy to rent to these brutes. So there's this whole fictional Mrs. Murphy. And so here you see Millet depicting Black power, and so again, urban uprisings and protests, riots, arson, as basically bearing the Civil Rights Bill, right? So he's not really thinking about a whole bunch of complex things like Black resistance, its relationship to Black rage or Black despair. He's just concerned. He's like, look, you have these Black riots. They're going to affect national discourse of civil rights. They can't pass legislation. So he was just really unsympathetic to this. And so unsympathetic that he would just treat it as like two sides of the same coin. Here you have Sam Millet, racist back-to-back, cause and effect. That's from 1968. So bigotry, and again, riots, like it's both hatred. So this is a kind of, treating it as look exactly the same. I think we probably want to problematize. But he saw them as having this sort of dialectical relationship with each other. Like they're both going to destroy the cause for Black equality. And even some really surprising ones. This often shocks people. He was not a fan of Snooker Core. He thought of them as, again, causing problems. This is also when Stokely Carmichael and Floyd McKissick were elected as leaders. And so if you can read the tales, it's the SNCC blocking rights, progress, arson, riots, looting, CORE, losing necessary financial support, confusing issues. So we thought CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, was good initially. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he thought also took a bad turn. And so he's depicting them as rats, like rats that betrayed the cause and like the initial good efforts that they made as organizations. Right? So these are characters you might expect, and they're in the Black press, right? They're not in the white press. This is a Black cartoonist, very invested in Black success. He would also do tons of cartoons celebrating when Black people were successful. He did this whole set of images and works depicting famous African Americans for children. So he was very invested in celebrating Black people, and he would depict them with beautiful, realistic drawings. But he did also have this way of talking about Black people that he thought were obstructing Black equality differently and drawing them differently. And he's not the only one to do this. I'm gonna move my face here a little bit. So here is an image, we're going back to Kyle Baker now, from Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, which is a graphic novel about the Baker the Nat Turner uprising, right? And if you look at this graphic novel, Nat Turner is depicted really gorgeously, classical heroic phenotype, high cheekbones, solemn, thoughtful for the most part. But here he's depicting some enslaved people who are not helping with the uprising. So you see this white man who's very tall, like, you know, normal size. These are full-grown men. He's depicting as short, as if they have arrested development, and that their complicity with white supremacy marks them as less than full men. So this is a contrast to an earlier moment in the text where actually Baker is showing Turner, he's hiding his reading from the master. So when the master shows up, he crosses his eyes, he contorts his face, and he looks like this caricature. He's doing almost kind of Jim Crow dance you see here. And the minute the master leaves, his face is serious again. So that's suggesting about how Turner could use this kind of dissemblance. And then the minute the master leaves, then he's staring angrily into the distance when his face is hidden from white surveillance. But here, these caricatures are saying, these are Black folks that are not helping with the revolutions. They're less than Black men. So the way that Black artists might do this distinction, right? Say like, okay, these are Black people we're going to draw realistically because they're down with the cause. They're helping us. Here are Black people we are going to draw in ways that show them as coonish, right? So they're caricatures that were not created by Black people, but they're making use of them to comment on Black behavior. Okay, so which brings me to comic strips in the middle, the sort of second half of the 20th century. So again, Black newspapers had lots of comic strips from Black artists. Some of you may have heard of someone like Jackie Orms, this first Black woman cartoonist. She had strips in the paper, various newspapers, particularly the Pittsburgh Courier, but they couldn't make it into the white press. Finally, white newspapers, late 60s, early 70s, started to think, okay, we have to put some Black people in the newspaper. So, and not just as a one character, because, you know, in Peanuts, there was like that one Black character, Franklin, and he didn't really have much, you know, of a personality, but Schultz felt like he had to put a Black person in because someone told him it'd be really meaningful. So it's nice he put someone in, but he just doesn't have much character. So you have, though, some other cartoonists who were producing strips, and they'd become nationally syndicated, which was a big deal. Again, many more newspapers at the time, so provided many more resources and success for Black folks. So Brunswick Brandon Jr. had this strip called Luther, and it focused on African-American children who are very poor. So they tell a lot of jokes about their poverty. They tell a lot of jokes about crime. They tell a lot of jokes about hunger, which is one of the examples on this strip. And when Brunswick Brandon Jr. started this strip, he received letters from both Black and white people suggesting that the tone of the issues of his strip were just inappropriate. So he writes this: "The first letter I received from a reader after Luther broke into print was from a young white woman who said, in no uncertain terms, that the problems to which I was addressing myself were far too serious to have fun with. She stated further that if I were white, I was sick. If I were Black, I was crazy. A letter from a Black inmate in a Philadelphia prison said that a particular strip was quite true, and that being Black, he saw no humor in it." And so this brings up another issue, that part of the critique is that Black folks shouldn't tell jokes about Black suffering. And I think we can still hear some of that in a lot of discussions sometimes when we see certain kinds of representation. Well, that's not funny, you know. But if you think about our long history of Black cultural production and how humor has been quite the tool to articulate Black experience, we wouldn't have Richard Pryor if you couldn't talk about Black suffering in comedy, right? So I think thinking about how you could still have in a comedic mode, particularly something like the funny pages. Because if you think about the funny pages, white children, which is what you had on the funny pages, they're happy-go-lucky, they're innocent. Little Orphan Annie, do you ever look at that strip? That was actually a very conservative strip. It was an anti-Roosevelt strip. He was anti-New Deal. So the whole point was that no matter what happened to Orphan Annie, she would just keep smiling. She would just have like these little black eyes, blank eyes, and smile. And, the sun will always come out tomorrow. And there are times you'll be like, why are you smiling? You're poor, you're homeless, you have no food. But the whole point was that, she's little Orphan Annie. So Brumsett Brennan Jr. pushed back against this, right? Brumsett Brennan Jr. is saying, look, when you put Black children here and you're playing with this sort of innocence trope, let's think about how we can play with that. And so he does this in the strip, right? So there's this white character who's unnamed, which is his own kind of political move. And he'll say, like, it's stupid to blame hunger on the war. It's like, my father said the country is rich enough to have both guns and butter. And this was the line in the period. And so the character talking to the main character, Luther, is named Pee-wee, and he's always hungry. We know he doesn't have enough food to eat. So he says, what's butter, Luther? Right. And so the joke is that he knows what guns are perfect well, but he doesn't know what butter is. So we can see how this is a caricature. This is a stereotype of Black inner city children, but that's the punch, right? Like we can say, that's the punchline. There's a bitterness there. There's a harshness there. It's trying to sort of make people go, oh, with the sort of brutality of that kind of joke, right? So it's a really rich, wonderful cartoon. And I encourage you to look his work up. All right, so let's move on. Comic strips you had for a number of decades, other people doing this kind of work. I want to talk about Milestone Comics, which was a short-lived imprint of DC by writers, cartoonists, artists of color in the early 90s. Some of you probably are most familiar with Static Shock, which became a cartoon. But my favorite was a comic book called Icon. And it's called Icon, but really the star of this was Raquel Irvin, or Rocket, who was this 15-year-old protagonist. And she's the sidekick, but she's actually the brains behind the title character. So she meets the superpowered Augustus Friedman, who crash landed in a cornfield or in a field of some sort in the 19th century. And he took the form of the first people he sees, and they were Black people, they were enslaved people. So he became a Black man, and he grows up to be a Black conservative. Interestingly enough, Clarence Thomas loved this comic book, and the late Dwayne McDuffie, who wrote for it, found that out and was sort of surprised, because it was actually a comic that was a critique of Black conservatism, but he really liked Icon. And so he's a conservative, and she says, look, you have all this power, you need to help Black people. And then they quickly decided to make her one of the most abject, sort of stereotypical character figure at that time that everyone was afraid of, which was the Black single teenage mother. And there was all this narrative in the 1990s about babies having babies. Over time, obviously, the teenage pregnancy rate has dropped substantially. But it was sort of really one of the primary signs of sort of the grotesque in US culture. It's like, oh, they're Black teenage mothers, they're gonna have the children, they won't take care of them, they'll be crack babies, etc. So she's not supposed to be heroic, and so they play with this. So here's this iconographic cover of Batman with Batman and Robin, the brand new adventures, the Batman Robin, the Boy Wonder. And then they do another version of this, making it almost look exactly the same. It says, all brand new adventures of Icon and Rocket, the unwed mother, right? So, and so there were some people, like there's one critic who said, I don't see anything new about Icon. It's this alien who falls to earth and takes on the form of an African slave, a Black Republican brought out of the closet, so to speak, by the soon-to-be unwed teenage mother and sidekick. She's really horrified by this. And I have to say, though, I hadn't really seen any Black teenage mother superheroes growing up. And so I found this very moving, let alone people who read Toni Morrison, which Raquel did. So I think that this was really pushing against this idea that if you have these representations, people say you shouldn't replicate these representations in popular culture, that they're just going to be stereotypes. Well, let's play with this. Like say that there are realities, and we'll play with the idea that you can't have these representations and have them be heroic. Okay, so next up. So another kind of cartoonist that we had in the 1970s, not very many of them. There's a period late 1960s, 1970s, early 80s, which is the heyday of underground cartooning. Some of you might have heard of someone called Robert Crum. There's even a film, a documentary called Crum. And a lot of these representations would be like really racist. There's lots of racism and sexism. There was also a period where we'd have lots of progressive feminist and gay cartoons. So there was a cartoonist named Larry Fuller, who initially wanted to go into doing superhero comics. And then I have on the right here, then Richard Grass Green, who was a Black cartoonist. He did a lot for fanzines. He also wanted to do superhero comics. And then then both of them ended up with these new trajectories. Larry Fuller only did some comics for a short period of time, and then he produced this comic called White Horror Funnies that was really intent on playing with these anxieties often about Black male sexuality, and particularly sexuality and sex between Black men and white women, and would use a lot of these horrible racist caricatures. And he explains why he did this. And I interviewed him, and he said, you know, I grew up in the Deep South, of course, so no blindfold was ever over my eyes. But it was also around this time that I began to really, really appreciate how much certain segments of society resented things, like he and his friend picking up white women, right? So even in a so-called liberal, and I think that's an overused word of late, post-hippie paradise like the West Coast in general, and San Francisco in particular, I tell you, with influences like Richard Pryor, to name but a few, my friend and I decided that we could at once bring our own particular vision to the underground scene with blatant send-ups and skewering of every point of view about said subject, all the while supplying the target audience with the scantily clad babes in interracial situations. And he says, you know, yes, this is the title. I never thought of white women as a group or demographic as whores than are now, but he's like, and if I cut this image to the cover, but one of the covers, for example, has a white woman, like thighs and sheet between thighs, and then a Black male hand in between her crotch, right? So it's really trying to scandalize and titillate people, right? And he's saying, I'm going to just make use of this. I'm going to, you know, pick on these things, which is what underground comics often did. And so here he has this comic, this wild fantasy of Mrs. White, where there's this white woman she's telling this dream to a psychiatrist about having sex with this Black man. And the Black man, he's nonverbal. And one of the things that's interesting about it is she also says really sort of negative racist things. And then it's this pretty long sexually explicit comic they have. So again, I did not include the most provocative images there, and you think, well, why would a Black man do this? And part of what you might want to think about is just saying, like, I know that these are in people's heads. I know that they're thinking these things. So he's playing with this idea that people have these fantasies about Black sexuality and the big Black penis and all of these things in terms of having sex with white women, and that even white women who might desire Black men could also be racist. And so playing with that, even with these representations. So he's doing a kind of early version of the sort of equal opportunity humor, except it's a little different. He's like, he's not outside of it. He says, I know as a Black man, I'm always the object of the joke, right? So it's not like South Park, right? Like they sort of feel like they're a little above the joke, but they're saying like, I know that Black men are the object of the joke. And then you have people like Grass Green, who's did a lot of really sort of interesting like autobiographical comics talking about his sex life. This is actually a kind of sex education comic called Thesis on Sex, where he talks and jokes about the Black penis. He has one where he talks to his Black penis is talking to him. And so these are, I should also say, like this Grass Green's autobiographical comics, you can only find them in archives. You can only find a lot of this work in archives. It's not reprinted. You don't have access to it. So to think about the kind of work in some, like in the comic strips much earlier on, some in the early 20th century, it's not even preserved. So to remember that we often have a lot of Black history that will just be lost to us forever. And to sort of be interested and invested in possibly preserving and making sure there's a way for us to have access to it. So I'm going to end with a discussion of the artist whose work graces my cover. This is from a book called Bayou. And it's basically a Black Alice in Wonderland story. He did 2 volumes. He is finally finishing the 3rd and publishing it soon. I think it'll probably be out in maybe 2023, but I'm not sure. Don't hold me to that. And it tells the story of a young girl named Lee Wagstaff, and she's a sharecropper's daughter living in Mississippi in 1933. And the white daughter of the woman who owns land her father farms on is swallowed up by a monster who lives in the bayou. And Lee's father is blamed for the murder, and he's going to be lynched. And so she ventures into the bayou to try to save her friend and thus her father from lynching. And so earlier, though, she's been dispatched in the bayou to retrieve this corpse of this young boy named Billy Glass, who was lynched for whistling at a white woman. And so we know, obviously, that this is a reference to Emmett Till. And Billy's body becomes tangled in the plant growth. And Lee goes in because she's a small child and they need a small hands to pull him out. And she catches a glimpse of his spirit, which has been transformed to this creature of the bayou, and that knows that his spirit remains even as it's been destroyed. And what Billy learns, though, is that if he doesn't find a way to let go of his pain and suffering over his murder, that he could be transformed into this creature that's this gollywog, right? And some of you may be familiar with the gollywog and the gollywog doll. It comes from a character, The Adventures of 2 Dutch Dolls and a Gollywog, a children's book published in 1895. It's non-human, it's monstrous, even though it was this child's toy that was extremely popular in the period. So it's this really well-known rendering of this sort of Black grotesque. And Loves used this rendering of this racist representation to explore Black history and time, right? The Gollywog doll, he doesn't have any allegiances. He's just enraged, right? And just, but also really poignant. And there's a lot of pathos when you run into the Gollywog figures. And in describing the Gollywog as the bad thing that happens to you, and to your spirit if you cling to your body, he suggests there's some agency despite victimization. So monstrosity can result if racialized violence defines Black subjects. And the Gollywog is this most profound representation of both victimization and intraracial destruction, right? And so the Gollywog doll here is attempting to pull Lee under. And then this other figure, Bayou, is not just the name of the book, but it's also, and the place where she goes, but it's also a character who's a friend. Bayou is trying to pull her out here and saves her from the Gollywog doll. And one thing about thinking about the work of racist caricature is that, of course, we want to put racist caricatures in the past, right? We don't want to see them in some ways, but they're not in the past. We still live with them. We're still affected with them. There's still narratives being circulated. And so, in representing the continued presence of historical violence through this Gollywog, it just reminds us that we live with these monstrosities. And I have to say, you know, I knew for a very long time I wanted the cover I had on the cover of my book. And when I sent it in, the press, like the art design people were like, oh, I don't know if we can use this. They're like, oh, we're afraid people are going to be offended. Oh, is this a negative representation? I said, well, I mean, this is a book. about racist caricature and is about a book about the racist caricatures that Black artists have produced as a commentary. And I was like, I didn't think that they actually would have produced a new racist caricature for my book, because I was really committed to this sense of how we are often pulled down or people tried to drag us down by these representations. And so many of the works that I've been talking about today are about how we deal with these representations. So they still use them, they still draw them, they make use of them in incredibly inventive and thoughtful ways, making new ways out of old ways, and the way that Black folks often do, to demonstrate that racist and racialized representations are a part of the vocabulary of Black comics and Black life, right? And so one of the things I'll just sort of end with is that W.B. Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk, he famously stated that white citizens view African Americans often wonder, how does it feel to be a problem? And I often think that this work and the works of the artists I talk about and admire so much are thinking about, how does it feel when the Black body is a problem? And so these artists are trying to imagine how we might take power away from these images and the narratives attached to them and arrive at something else that can feel like liberation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wanzo. We really appreciate your words. We do have quite a few questions in our chat, and so Maureen and I will go back and forth with these questions that we have. The first question we have is, what destroyed Harriman's career? I believe, one of the cartoons that you had previously done, if you know that information.
Well, what I should say is that nothing destroyed Harriman's career. I mean, the point is that he passed for his entire life. His own family did not discover, his own children did not discover he was passing until after his death, right? But the idea about the musical most cartoons is like, what if this was a cartoon or a comic strip that illustrates the risks of his career being destroyed if people found out who he was. And actually Crazy Cat, as much as Hearst admired it, and now again is understood as one of the most important comic strips in the history of comic strips in the newspapers, it wasn't actually the most successful comic strip. But it was held on to because Hearst, the publisher, really admired it so much. Some people push against that and say that actually, that's an overstated history, but often people say that. But I mean, his, Black cartoonists were not getting jobs doing comics and cartoon art. And it would have been very hard, I think, if people had known what was on his birth certificate.
Our second question, in your search, did you read any info on how Mickey Mouse character was developed and depicted from what white folks saw and made gestures imitating Black folks' movements, etc.? What is your thoughts on the Mickey Mouse character?
Yeah, there's a great book by my friend Nick Salmon called The Birth of an Industry that does talk about Mickey Mouse as a caricature that is shaped by history of minstrelsy. And I think I could probably put in the chat for you, let's see, and he has a website where you can look at some of the early kind of racist, some of the racist Disney cartoons. I mean, I've sometimes been in conversations with people, and I was on the talk show, people like, oh, we have to eliminate all these, racist representations historically that we have in media. And the reality is, I mean, racism is basically part of racism and sexism is sort of the bedrock of American media representation. So, I mean, we sort of almost eliminate a huge percentage of our culture. So we sort of learn to live with it, but also to acknowledge it and acknowledge it's there. And then, figure out when we do it. But so I'm not really a fan of saying like, well, let's just get rid of all these things. I don't think we need to circulate things all the time, but I think it's just important. It's part of our archive, and that's what we deal with. So,
thank you.
In the story that you had shared earlier about the girl who was in the water, someone had asked, how did the young girl end up in the water again?
So, so first she goes in to get the boy, but then again, she goes through the bayou because her father's been arrested, because the white girl she played with, who's the daughter of the owner of the farmer father's a sharecropper on, has been swallowed up by the bayou. So she ends up encountering all of these caricatures, and they basically are caricatures and people who've been transformed often by racial violence as the sort of other world. So she's in and out of the bayou. It's this other world that she goes into. So it's bayou's out of print right now, but I highly recommend it. So she's dwelling in that space and sort of in and out, like there are all these struggles and adventures she goes through. And so that's why she's back there again.
Thank you. Next question. This person wrote a couple of questions. The first part of it, why do people associate not only relaxed hair, but also bodily hair on women to mean an individual is an extreme radical? It seems as a way for society to continue to control Black people and women.
Well, yes. Black hair is all about control. That's a whole other conversation. Black hair is about control. I mean, obviously the Crown Act has been really interesting. And in trying to address the discrimination that Black people have often experienced in relationship to hair. And that natural hair, you know, and you get this from Black people too, that, you know, you can't, that if you have natural hair, if you have locks, you know, you're unprofessional, you can't get a job, that you're unclean. There are all these sort of scripts around that. And then with hair, I mean, obviously there have been moments and then times where some women have embraced not shaving in various contexts as a part of feminism. And I think that battle was lost. I mean, if now there's even less hair everywhere, even, you know, the porn industry has sort of naturalized the absence of bodily hair so much that I remember reading a study that there were a whole bunch of young men who didn't know that women had vaginal hair because the only time they'd see vaginal hair, it's like, they'd just seen porn. So I was just like, well, that's disturbing. So, I mean, I think just thinking about like bodily regulation as such a part of respectability politics in all kinds of contexts, it affects lots of people in different cultures and contexts is important.
Thank you. And her second question is, I feel as if most people aren't wise enough to pick up on the fact that these comics are not actually being outright racist, but trying to actually help give Black struggles representation through comics. Do you think that these comics might have caused more harm than good? For example, the far right oversharing and misinterpreting Barry Blitz 2008 New Yorker comic.
So I love that question. It's the whole point of my book. So I think we can all agree that people need to be better readers of media and have better skills in terms of interpretation. It is having actually causing extraordinary damage to our democracy. For example, just that people can't even tell the difference between fake and real, and sort of trying to figure out different kinds of interpretation. So I think that being better critical readers in terms of interpretation, and it doesn't mean that everyone's always going to agree interpretation, but there's some interpretations that are better than others and shaped by evidence. And I think that, you know, when you have faculty at your schools and various other contexts, people who do this work, that we're trying to teach people to be more literate in terms of visual reading and other kinds of interpretation. It's part of what the humanities does.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question, what modern day imagery do you believe shapes the thinking of individuals these days, since printed media, characters, and cartoonists aren't as prominent as other sources of information with the most recent generations?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question because, I mean, one thing that I feel that I see in social media all the time is that there are a whole bunch of images like that circulate on Twitter and circulate you know, Tumblr is now sort of out of fashion, but I see images and cartoons on Twitter all the time. And often without the cartoonist, I'll say, hey, cite the cartoonist. Like, I mean, I actually think we see a lot of images, but obviously memes are really important. But sometimes cartoons circulate as memes. I'm like, oh, it's also a cartoon. Tick-Tock obviously is rising. I mean, the thing about popular media is that, you know, and just mass culture in general, sort of since the 19th century, there are always new forms, and they're often reformulated in relation to what sort of came before. So there's like just what we're saying that's important in social media now. Like, you know, a few years ago, I would have said, well, Tumblr is very popular, and no, not so much. But, you know, TikTok's very popular. Will TikTok be huge in 10 years? You know, this will be recorded. I don't know if I should like make predictions, but I have my doubts. I think there'll be something else, maybe. So, I mean, I think that, you know, there's always something that's going to be new. But the thing about comics and cartoon art and caricature, I mean, I think you see it. And, you know, I didn't talk about the Black Panther because I know that you had to talk about the Black Panther fairly recently. You know, it was really fascinating to me that the Black Panther, you know, if you read some of those early comics, and they're really fantastic, but they're also, again, they're not created by Black people initially. Black people became creators later on. They were artists. There were some artists earlier on, and then there weren't Black writers for some time. But there were also, you know, white writers who did tremendous work. And a lot of what the first Black Panther film was based on, some of the basic plot line came from, you know, a white writer. But if you look at this comic, I mean, I was shocked at how the film and the Coogler and the rest of the team was able to rehabilitate the caricatures from that comic. Like, Gorilla Man should not have become as like fine and cool a man as we ended up with M'Baku. Like, that just didn't seem possible in my imaginary. So I actually think the thing about comics and cartoons is, why I did the sort of historical perspective, that's actually inflecting our culture in ways that's sometimes not even legible to you, right? Like, so there's so much. I mean, one of the things about comics and cartoon right now, I mean, I can't even keep up with the number of television shows from comics. Like, it used to be I could, but I'm just like, oh, wait, is that from a comic, right? I mean, the number of comics that are films or TV shows now, I mean, it's just stunning. I mean, and some of the most popular things, like obviously Walking Dead, they're just all over. I mean, the CW almost gave their network entirely over to DC. Like, I mean, it's just everywhere. So, I mean, I actually think that comics and cartoons are bigger than they've ever been.
Thank you. Our next question is, what do you think about Boondocks?
So I write about the Boondocks in my book. You know, the Boondocks was a really important strip in its time. One of the things I find fascinating about the move from the strip to the show is he emptied out, I think, actually some of the best political commentary for the show. I actually had one of these like weird things where I was sitting on a stage interviewing him many years ago. It was probably now, I don't know, 16, 17 years ago, when I used to be at Ohio State. And he admitted that he did that. And there's still like some good things that were in the TV show. But I think the comic strip is really, really where some of the best work is. And so part of my plea with this book too is to try to get people to remember to go back to these works as a really important part of our Black cultural archive and art and work that we should know. Because I suspect many people will just know the show. It's on DVD, it's streaming, etc. But they won't know the comic strip. And that's really where his best and most really politically and transgressive work was. And I can just say, and I don't know the age of the person who's asking me this, but I remember when it was coming out, and just every time his strip came out, it was just, you know, you had his good days and his bad days, but I mean, it was just a powerful strip. But what I want to say about people like Brunswick Brandon Jr., there were precursors to that and people who did really great work as cartoonists before Aaron Magruder came along.
Thank you for that. So the next question was, what made you decide to write this book, and how long did you research for it?
Oh, that's always such a depressing question. How long do I work on books? I mean, each of my books have basically taken me 10 years. I'm hoping the next book won't. We'll see. Um, so I didn't grow up reading comics, which makes me a little unusual as a comic scholar, at least not in a really huge way. I mean, I read some strips like Boondocks and stuff, but I didn't read superhero comics, or which is I think what a lot of people who are in my field do, at least in the U.S. And then when I was in grad school, I still wanted to read for pleasure, so I started with some things like Vertigo and The Sandman and things like that, because I wanted to read for pleasure, but I was getting a PhD in English and I was sometimes reading a novel a day, and I could not actually read any other fiction. And the first essay I wrote was about Truth, Red, White, and Black, the Black Captain America. Some of you may have watched the recent Falcon Disney show about Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And they have Isaiah Bradley on that. And that was the first article I wrote about the Black Captain America, a comic. And I interviewed the writer, Bob Morales, who wrote a story that thought about the Tuskegee experiment and said, like, yeah, you know, really, they would have experimented on Black people to sort of develop a syndrome or a super soldier syndrome. Can't even say the word. I keep wanting to say syndrome, but that's not, serum. And it's interesting with the continuity because people were really opposed to that. So there's a version of Truth early on where they said they would have done it first. And then they changed it because they said it had to be Steve Rogers first. But really the inspiration was the idea that they would have experimented on Black people first because they were thinking about Tuskegee and because of Black people being expendable in that kind of medical experimentation. And so that was just a really, it was just going to be a one-off, but I went to work at Ohio State. But if any of you ever go to Columbus, Ohio, please visit the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, which is a wonderful archive and museum of comic art. It has all the Calvin and Hobbes for people who love such things. And a lot of my research was done there. And I worked there for 8 years. And the book took me about 10 years. I mean, I did other things wrote other things while I was doing it. But a lot of what I was able to do is because I did have this relationship with the archive.
Thank you. This question, your concluding statement is very interesting. Are you saying or deducing that by laughing about ourselves, it helps us understand ourselves and become more understanding and strengthens us?
Well, I mean, I do think that comedy is a tool of power and humor is a tool of power. And I think, again, we have seen this, that Black people and various subjected groups have used comedy and humor as a political tool, and satire is a political tool. But I also do want to emphasize a lot of what I'm talking about isn't necessarily funny. It's biting, it's edgy, but it's not necessarily going to produce like ha-ha. So a lot of comics and cartoon art isn't funny, but it is making use of caricatures to produce political commentary, because this visual language it's been central to discourses of citizenship. People have used these negative representations all the time to wound Black people in these specific contexts, but it's been used, caricature is often been a tool of oppression to sort of reduce people, to say that they're lesser. And so we could say that we're not going to use satire and these kinds of tools ourselves, but I think that, you know, often subjective people are very good at using these tools and actually better at it.
Thank you.
Our next question asks, can you expand on the importance of saving these characters as the history of American cultural heritage?
Well, I mean, it's not that I'm interested in saving the caricatures per se. I'm saying so there are a variety of different arguments. I am interested in saving Black art. So this is full stop. I want to save Black art. And one thing, I have another project where I'm looking at how, and they're often doing different things, but how African-American artists like Romare Bearden, who are sort of considered really high, sort of prominent artists, they actually started off as cartoonists. There are a number of Black artists who started off as as cartoonists, some for leftist progressive newspapers, some for the Black press, and for newspapers that I can't even track down. I don't even know if they exist anymore. Try to find some random newspaper from Indiana that an artist was producing in. So I think these are deteriorating. They're going away. We can't find things. We need to do this work of preservation. But the other piece is that I also think that these representations are a part of our history and they did things. And so it's also why people still use them and trying to hurt us. And it's why it's also sometimes people use them to explore commentary, right? And so I think, and then sometimes we might have representations that are negative and nasty, but then they're couched in things that we might want to keep them for some other reason. So one of the famous things people say, like, oh, like Gone with the Wind, like Gone with the Wind should go away. So what would it mean to say that Gone with the Wind goes away? This is the film where, you know, Hattie McDaniel won an Academy Award for, and we can have all kinds of opinions about that. But I don't know that we want a world in which, like, we don't have her representation. I have lots of issues with particularly Butterfly McQueen, but I have issues with that film. But I also do recognize that there's some things maybe about her performance and just Hattie McDaniel's history and things to know about her that we want to know and have. Or just people who were able to construct really complex roles despite caricature. And despite the limitations on what they were able to do or what was allowed them, people like Josephine Baker or, you know, I have issues with, say, you know, seeing, you know, certain kinds of constructions, a lot of early Black film. But I mean, if we eliminate all of these representations where Black people were working under constraints, we're eliminating a lot of our Black culture. Like, this is part of our history. And there are really talented performers who had to produce things under constraints.
Thank you. Next question. How would the world be if we didn't react to racist caricature?
Well, I mean, I guess my question is, what does it mean to say, what does it mean that people shouldn't react to things meant to hurt you? I mean, or just even to react to things at all. I mean, you could just say like, oh, what's there? And I'm just going to ignore it. I mean, when that Australian editorial cartoonist produced an editorial cartoon of Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams and produced this really nasty, grotesque representation of Serena and drew Naomi Osaka as if she was a blonde white woman, he had an intent there about how he was representing Black people and how he went, and then also just the erasure of Naomi Osaka's identity, right? And I wrote about this, and I will just say that, and you know, we know this, that Black people, women, when you write things and, you know, for general audiences, I mean, you get horrible racist emails, phone calls, etc. I got tons of stuff, and people were really doing extra. They were like sending me like color panels to say like, this is really Naomi Osaka's skin tone and hair. She isn't presented as white. I was like, look, if you look at how this works, if you're a critical reader, look structurally how this cartoon works. This is depicting Serena Williams as this monstrous, grotesque figure in the tradition of Black racist caricature, and depicting Naomi Osaka as a white woman, and erasing a whole bunch of other context here. And this cartoonist has a history of racist representations. So, I mean, we can say like, oh, it's there, and I'm just going to pretend like people aren't saying or doing racist things. I just don't, I don't think ignoring representations, ignoring what people said has ever gotten us anywhere. Because they'll just keep being produced for people's sadistic pleasure, and to devalue people who are less advantaged, oppressed, and historically treated as less.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question, we only have, I'll just let you know, we've got about 3, so it's not terribly much longer, but person is wanting your opinion on the evolution of today's comics and or today's cartoons versus back then comics and cartoons.
Well, that's a lot of books. So I will just say, I'll just speak to this in relationship to the diversity question. You know, I think we're in, one of the things that's really exciting to me about being in this field is that I just think we're in this golden age of really gorgeous, amazing things being produced in comics and comics. I think that animation, I think there's some diversity in animation, which that's not my field. I don't do this well. So I do popular culture in general. So I look at some things, but that's not primarily what I do. I tend to look at something more, maybe there's adaptation, but I'm particularly bad at things about kids. It's funny because they think I'm doing stuff for kids, and I have to explain to people very clearly. And if this was not clear from this talk, my book is not for children. It's not talking about texts that were for children. Like, there are images that children should not see. I don't do things around representations for children. That's not what I write about. Instead, I wrote about Princess and the Frog once. I think that we're in an age where people are doing really interesting things. And I think it's a fantastic moment. And I think I think that part of then what's really distressing to me and tragic is all this book banning going around. And you know what? A lot of what's being banned are graphic novels and memoirs produced by cartoonists who are of color or who are queer. And you see it all over the place. They're just banning books left and right. And I think that they're banning them. That's a testament to their power too, even though I also think that people aren't even looking at this thing that they're banning. They see the title and they know what it's about, or vaguely know what it's about, or think they know what it's about. And they just know they don't want anything that's about Black people or Asian people or a queer teenager, and they're just banning them. And I think that there's a lot of great stuff being produced, but we have to keep fighting so that people have spaces to produce them and so that people have an opportunity to read them.
Thank you. Question: what comic was most controversial during the slavery era?
Well, there weren't really comics during the slavery era. And so, I mean, one thing that is important, and I didn't have a chance to talk about in my book, or talk about it in the talk, but so cartoons in the US really rose up in the 19th century, and you really started editorial cartoons in particular, because of technology and changes in what was possible in terms of printing cheaply. And so Thomas Nast, who's considered the father of American cartooning, actually did a lot of work around representing Black people. And what was interesting about his work is that he was in support of abolition, he was in support of the Union, but once Black people were free, he often depicted them with racist caricature. He shifted from depicting them realistically to depicting them in racist ways because he was concerned about the roles they would take in government after emancipation. And so it wasn't that there's necessarily things that were, more or less controversial necessarily in that period, but it was the point when cartoon and comic art really started to rise up. And in terms of controversy, I mean, well, one thing in thinking about Nast and, just going through for a number of decades, there were times when politicians actually were really angry that editorial cartoonists were depicting them. Nast famously drew a politician so well that when he was on the run, like people found him because they recognized him from Nast's depictions. And at one point, someone actually tried to pass some legislation a few decades later that editorial cartoonists, like to make it illegal to depict political figures in editorial cartoons because they were just so concerned about the damage they could do.
Okay, thank you. So the last question that we had was just a reminder of the name of the last character that you had on the screen with the little girl.
So it's Jeremy Love, and Bayou is the title of the comic. They're out of print. There were 2 volumes, but you probably find them kind of expensive used. But the 3rd volume that completes the story, he is finishing it. And I do anticipate that it will be out at some time soon.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wanzo, for leading us in this discussion and sharing your vast knowledge on characters and the history. I just want to remind our students, first of all, thank you for everybody who is participating and has attended our speaker series here. Students, don't forget to inform your instructors about your attendance if they've offered extra credit.